The Center for Research in Post-Humanities, Vankura University, presents a two-day international conference on post-human condition in the Anthropocene.
Thank you. We are going to begin our first technical session of our two-day international conference on post-human condition in the Anthropocene. And Professor Andrew J. Milner is our first speaker. Andrew is Professor Emeritus of English and Comparative Literature at Monash University from 2014 until 2019. He was also Honorary Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. Milner was politically active by turn in the campaign of nuclear disarmament, the Labour Party Young Socialists, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, the International Socialists, the Socialist Workers' Party, and in Australia, People for Nuclear Disarmament. In the early 21st century, he appears to have joined the Australian Greens. Milner's academic interests include literary and cultural theory, the sociology of literature, utopia, dystopia, and science fiction. His work has been published in English in Australia, India, the US, the UK, and has been translated into French, German, Portuguese, Chinese, Persian, and Korean. He has attracted attention for work strongly influenced by Lucien Goldman on the sociology of the 17th century literature. Subsequently, he has become better known for his advocacy of Raymond Williams's cultural materialism and for studies of utopia and dystopian science fiction. He has a strong interest in the cultural sociology of Pierre Bourdieu. He has authored many monographs and research articles. Now I welcome Professor Milner. Milner, the whole platform is all yours now.
To you, you're in India, I assume, most of you, and I'm in Australia. And I'd just like to make a couple of observations about our two countries. The first is, they're all about things we have in common, actually. The first is, of course, that we share an enthusiasm for Test cricket, where both countries are extremely good at Test cricket. In fact, they're the two best Test cricket sides in the world. That's good. I like that. I think that's a very healthy thing to know. On the other hand, some of the other things that we share in common are not so positive. And one of the things we share in common is that our two countries are major contributors to global warming. India's recent industrialization has made massive use of fossil fuels. That is not so true of Australia, but what is true of Australia is that Australia is one of the world's, and in many years, the world's largest exporter of coal. And these are part of the problems that when we're talking about climate change, this happens to be a serious problem. Now, I'm talking about ecoterrorism. I'm going to move very quickly, as one always should, to a definition of terms. But the eco in ecoterrorism merely means refers to, it's got something to do with climate changes. It's shorthand. What I think is more difficult to define is the second part of my term, that is terrorism. Because the honest truth is that in general, terrorism is what you do, and what I do is freedom fighting. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I think this is very obvious if you think of contemporary affairs. You can see this in the conflict between Israel and Likud, the government in Israel, and Hamas in Gaza. Hamas refers to Israel as a terrorist state, and its supporters do likewise. But on the other hand, the Israeli army and behind it, the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government refer to Hamas as terrorists. I think one has to try for a definition of terrorism that is slightly more neutral than that encompasses, if you like, both what Liquid have to say and what Hamas has to say as well. Because in their language, all terrorism indicates is mutual antipathy. Right. So I'm going to suggest something more formal, if you like. And it's not quite a definition, it's just a couple of empirical generalizations. In the first place, I want to define terror. And terror is the use, in my usage at any rate, is the use of political violence against property and persons, and all persons, it's the extra legal use of political violence for political purposes. That's the terror. The terrorists, on the other hand, are those who use such terror. Normally, these are themselves extra-legal paramilitary forces, but they may not be so, because terror can be used by legal forces, as I think it is in Gaza at present by the IDF. What I'm trying to do here is to move towards a definition of terror and terrorism that is not dependent on one's sympathies. So that's what I've been talking about. I'm trying to get to a position in which it is irrelevant whether or not one agrees with the terrorist motives. They are terrorists either way. Now, I'm saying this because I've been struck by the extent to which terrorism is only been used in Australia, and I assume in other Western countries too, to describe those who we are against, and specifically in Gaza, it's used against Hamas. But in the definitions I've come up with, you'll notice that really both Hamas and Israeli Defense Forces are terrorists in the actions that they're taking in Gaza and Gaza/Israel. Terrorism has a very bad press in the Western world. I don't know about India, but in the Western world, it is very much it's being used as a label to define one's enemies. But what I want to stress is this: it was not always so. In fact, if you look back to the 1950s, and I'm old enough to remember them just, it's clear that post-Second World War treatments of the European resistance movements against Nazism were very positive, even though those movements were typically represented as terrorists by the Nazi German government. Indeed, the bomber crews who bombed Germany were described by the German authorities as terror flyers. But in popular fiction and film and television, but also in literary fiction, you can see at that time there are more positive representations of the resistance as a form of terrorism. I have two examples to give you. These are both literary fiction, but I think it works even more so to popular fiction. But both Simone de Beauvoir's *The Blood of Others* and Sartre's *Iron in the Soul*. That's not a literal translation, but that is the English translation. Both of these are existentialist novels, but they're novels that look at the existential dilemmas of resistance. However, more recently, and I'm rushing up towards the present, more recently, one doesn't tend to find, certainly not in the West, and despite Australia's geographical location, it is very much culturally and socially part of the West. One tends to find much more, one doesn't find positive representations of resistance and terrorists. And this is even true of environmental fiction, which I want to move on to very quickly. If you look at, this is a well-known French environmental fiction by Jean-Marc Ligny. The English title is literally Exoduses. It came out in 2012. And what's interesting there is the terrorists and it is about terrorist attacks. That is the Davos Dome in the not too distant future, and the terrorists, the firebrands as they're called, attack and destroy the Davos Dome, and thus destroying the few places where it is still possible to survive in a world that's becoming increasingly uninhabitable. So the terrorists are represented as essentially foolish and self-destructive. This is also true to take an English language example, Richard Powers' The Overstory. Here, again, one sees radical environmentalists attempting to destroy property, not persons. They're trying to destroy logging equipment. But in fact, the result is that one of them dies, and that leads to the eventual dissolution of the group. So that even in environmental fiction, certainly in American environmental fiction, terrorism, ecoterrorism, is represented as an essentially negative and foolhardy strategy. Now, that's why I've selected the three texts that I want to talk about today, because they are unusual in climate fiction, and unusual more generally in Western fiction in representing the case for ecoterrorism. The three I've picked, I'm afraid none of them are from India or indeed from Asia. One is from Europe, one is from North America, and one is from my own country, from Australia. The European one is from Finland. It is Antti Tuomainen's Parantaja, which is translated into English as The Healer. The English translation came out in 2013. The one from North America is from the United States. It's one that I know is being addressed by other papers in this conference, which is Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which came out in 2020. The Australian one, which I'm sure most of you haven't heard of, but it concerns me precisely because I live here, is by J.R. Burgmann, and it's Children of Tomorrow, which came out last year, 2023. Right, so I want to say a little about each of these in turn, and then I shall make some general observations about them. Let me begin with Tuomainen's The Healer. This is Antti Tuomainen, and The Healer. That's the English translation. The English translation came out in 2013. Now, in Finland, it was extremely successful. It was voted the best Finnish crime novel of the year, and it is, I stress, a crime novel, but it is a climate fiction as well. And to date, it has been translated into more than 20 languages, including English. I'm not sure about Bengali, but it certainly has been translated into Chinese and Russian. At the beginning of the narrative, anthropogenic climate change seems merely to be the novel's setting, and one leaves it at that. But slowly it becomes apparent that climate change is really rather what Darko Suvin would call the novum. That is the loosely scientific novelty that drives the action of the novel. Now, the central character and narrator is Tapani Lehtinen, and he is a poet living in a near-future climate-ruined Helsinki, whose wife Johanna, who is a journalist, disappears 2 days before Christmas, the Christian celebration of Christmas. And the novel recounts his 3-day search for her, what has happened to her. The city itself is wonderfully well described as a climate-ruined city. It is rain-sodden, its metro system and its seaside suburbs have been flooded. Its railway station is packed with climate refugees from the south. Tapani discovers that Johanna, his wife, has been investigating a serial killer who describes himself as the healer, and who he kills are business executives and politicians who he deems responsible for climate change. DNA evidence suggests that to Tapani that Parantaja is in fact, in fact, Pasi Takiena, a one-time medical student who supposedly died 5 years previously in a flu epidemic. But he follows up with his computer search and discovers that in fact his wife knew Pasi, that they had lived in a shared household together as students, and that they had both been radical environmental activists. So the crime narrative follows Tapani in his search for Johanna, a search that eventually leads to a climactic confrontation at the railway station, where Pasi plans to catch a train north. In the encounter, Pasi, the poet, and Tapani and poet and Pasi, the poet and the terrorist, confront each other. And Pasi, the terrorist, says, and I quote, but you can read it, I hope, "I'm on the side of good, Tapani. There was a time when I strove for nothing less than saving the world. Now that the world can't be saved, I have to make sure that good continues to live for as long as evil and selfishness." The key phrase here is, now that the world can't be saved. Right, now he does in fact rescue Johanna. So the reader is left with individual romantic love as the only outstanding positive value, as it is, by the way, in many dystopias. For Tapani and Johanna, the one remaining consolation they have is their own romantic relationship. As Tapani reflects, after the following Easter, remember this takes place at Christmas, the following Easter, he receives an unrepentant email from Pasi, and he reflects this thus: something happens when I touch Johanna. Something in my heart stirs. Something says, this is right, this is good, and it is good. I'm part of her, and she's part of me. We're as happy as two people can be in this world. Whatever happens, I will love Johanna. But what will happen, we know actually, is that their world will end, because that is what is happening. So we're left with yes, romantic love as a consolation, but no way out. No way out except the one identified by the terrorist. Now, the second novel that I want to look at is Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which, as I said earlier on, is I gather there are a couple of other papers about that, but I'm still going to address it. Robinson is, of course, of my three writers, he's by far the best known internationally, partly because he's the best known in the United States. And his science fiction, he's a science fiction writer, but not only that, his science fiction has become increasingly focused on the promise of radical social change and the threat of runaway climate change. Indeed, there's an interesting sense in which you can read his novels as a kind of comparative sociology of climate and social change. I've put up here all the awards that Robinson has had, and there are lots of them. The John W. Campbell Award, Hugo Awards, Nebula Awards. He was even named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine. And he has been, I suppose unsurprisingly, guest of honor at one of the world's science fiction conventions. Right. Now, Robinson's The Ministry for the Future is in many ways the most impressive to date of his climate fictions. And unlike The Healer, it does actually point to a positive outcome from climate crisis. And it's interesting the way that, I mean, Robinson has tried repeatedly for positive outcomes. And they are either sometimes constitutional, political constitutional ones, and at other times they're insurrectionary. In New York 2140, which came out in 2017, he essentially was concerned with constitutional change, with the election of radical Democrat politicians to Congress. In Red Moon, which came out the following year in 2018, he's concerned with a quasi-revolutionary option which occurs on the moon, but also in the People's Republic of China and in the United States of America. What the Ministry for the Future does, it seems, which came out in 2020, is an interesting combination of both the constitutional democratic and the insurrectionary. It's the insurrectionary, of course, that involves ecoterrorism. The constitutional option revolves around the ministry, the eponymous ministry, which is located in Zurich in Switzerland and is established in 2025. We hope, we've only got a year to go before it happens, as a subsidiary body for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And it's established in conjunction with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations. Right. The ministry's head is Mary Murphy. And the role of the ministry, as you can see here, is, and I quote, to advocate for the world's future generations of citizens and for all citizens, for all living creatures, present and future, who cannot speak for themselves. That is Mary Murphy's role as head of the ministry, and it's the role of those who work for her ministry. Right. Mary Murphy is Irish, I should mention. The insurrectionary option, however, the revolutionary terrorist option, is represented by a terrorist group that are Indian, in fact, based in India. I don't have an Indian novel, but I do have Indian terrorists, and these are known as the Children of Kali. The Children of Kali use drones to bring down passenger jets and to infect millions of cattle with mad cow disease, BSE. The novel is organized into 106 chapters, which move backwards and forwards between personal narratives, factual summaries of climate science, and objective slices of fictional future history. It begins with an unprecedented heat wave in India, which kills 20 million people in the novel. Right. And this is viscerally described from the standpoint of an American aid worker called Frank May, who is one of the survivors of this mass death, who subsequently suffers post-traumatic stress disorder and later still becomes a comparatively ineffectual eco-terrorist. Now, what I want to stress here is that Robinson is clear that eco-terrorism really works in this novel. It's not the only thing that works. The constitutional option works too, but so does eco-terrorism. He says, and I quote, I will explain what's on the page there, but what Robinson stresses is that in the 40s, that's the 2040s, in the 40s and after, less beef got eaten, less milk was drunk, and fewer jet flights were made. Right. Some things, where he writes, were just too dangerous to continue doing. When your veggie burger tasted just as good while your beef package proclaimed guaranteed safe with a liability waiver in the bottom, you knew a different time had come. Right. More significantly, however, Robinson strongly implies that these Children of Kali are an offshoot of the ministry itself. And this brings me to Mary Murphy's chief of staff, her Indian chief of staff, Badin Bahadur. And Bahadur actually admits to Murphy that he has established a secret black wing for the ministry. And he warns her, and I quote, that there might be some people who deserve to be killed. Later, an anonymous narrator, who is almost certainly Badin Bahadur, actually says, and I quote again, this is to the Children of Kali. I understand you. I've helped you. I've helped work like yours all over the world. I've done more to stop the next heat wave than anyone you have ever met. You've done your part. I've done mine. I am Kali. The reference is, of course, to Hinduism. Now, this combination of constitutionalism and terrorism leads direct to the novel's positive outcome, which, and I quote, the price of success is bought too cheaply. Sorry, I'm glossing. but it leads to success as far as Robinson is concerned. Now it's difficult not to sympathise with Robinson. This is Robinson. This is an article that Robinson wrote in the American journal Utopian Studies, and he says he describes the possible catastrophe that we are faced with. The article, the description here, I'm sorry. The article is entitled "Remarks on Utopia in the Age of Climate Change," and it's published in Utopian Studies in 2016. And you see what he describes is that if we in fact goes on, the climate change deteriorates in this way, we will be, he says, living on a different planet in a significantly damaged biosphere with its life support system so harmed that human existence will be substantially threatened. And then he concludes, it has become a case of utopia or catastrophe, and utopia has gone from being a somewhat minor literary problem to a necessary survival strategy. Now, of course, I want to leave it there. This is a very impressive novel, and it's double-edged strategy. Both ecoterrorism and constitutionalism is at one level very persuasive. It depends, of course, whether you can imagine that the two will be combined in the way that Robinson imagines. This takes me to my third novel. This is by an Australian writer, J.R. Burgmann, and it's a debut novel. It's his first novel, and so I suspect that nobody here has heard of it, but nonetheless, I have, because I live in Australia, right? This is the picture of the book launch of the novel. The novel traces the progress of a group of Australian university-based friends from the real 2016 Tasmanian bushfires. I don't know what in India you may well call them wildfires. The bushfires is a distinctly Australian usage, but there were very, very bad bushfires in Australia in 2016, and those really did happen. But it traces the friendship between this group. The main protagonists are two, originally when we first meet them, two PhD students, Anna Backer and Evie Wetherill, and they're both scientists, and they're both climate scientists. And the novel organizes essentially around the contradiction between the precise and accurate scientific understandings of climate collapse on the one hand, and the complete incapacity on the other of our wider social structures to respond to this knowledge. I'm sorry, I can't move on to the quotes I've got. I've lost control of my PowerPoint. Anyway, Arnie, Evie, and their colleagues, friends, and relatives live through this contradiction, pursuing a series of political social alternatives, ecoterrorism included. Arnie's elder brother, Freddie, is an activist rather than an academic. And it's he, in the end, who collaborates with Arnie, makes use of Arnie and Evie's son, Raph, so as to destroy the towers in which the rich live in the climate-ruined world that they inhabit. They're living in what the author describes as the sea hood of Stanley. I assume that's somewhere near the Malvinas. The sea hood of Stanley, deep within what he describes as the Pacific zone of the United Nations of seasteads, where, and I quote, where millions of the dislanded struggle to stay afloat, and where Freddie, that's the activist, himself contemplates, I quote, one final explosive hurrah. Freddie is scathing about his nephew Raf's willingness to work for those who live in the towers or in the seasteads, because there's very little land left. But he uses Raf's delivery job to the towers where the wealthy live as a means to attack the towers. He warns his partner Kim, and she in turn warns Raf, that they're actually going to plant explosives that will shatter the towers. And I quote, and this is an act of extreme ecoterrorism. I quote, then a distant series of low concussions brings them to a standstill, rattling through their skulls, ringing in their ears. Out of that horrifying sound, drumming like war, comes a blinding light that sears the horizon. They turn away instinctively, shielding their eyes. They look back to see the towers, one after another, firing like distant torches, semaphoring the end of the world as they know it. Then we moved at the end of the novel to a post-catastrophic world in which has a much smaller population and much smaller landmass as well, actually, because of flooding. And Anna and Evie have survived, and they're living in one of the rewilding Edens that grow out of the end of this world. And Anna agrees with his friend Virgil never to discuss the internal happenings of that time when, and I quote, when the towers came down in such symbolic and meticulously coordinated terror. Now, all three of these novels, now I still can't bring back my quotes. I'm sorry, I've lost control altogether of my PowerPoint. All three of these novels deal squarely with the possible costs and benefits of ecoterrorism. And that is actually why I find them interesting. This is unusual, actually. You might have thought that there'd be more widespread treatments of ecoterrorism, at least in climate fiction, but there don't seem to be. Right. Ecoterror, let me go back and say a little about each. Tuomainen's The Healer is written overwhelmingly from Tapani's point of view. And thus it seems to invite us to share in his repudiation of Party's terroristic justice. But Party's Good Friday email, the email which arrives months after the Christmas events, reminds us of the latter's claim to be on the side of good. Just as surely as Tapani's invocation of romantic love fails to convince anybody as a serious solution to social collapse. Yes, you can be in love, but it's not going to change anything. So the reader is left with a choice between two options, neither of which offers a serious political solution to the problem of climate catastrophe. Robinson's The Ministry for the Future invites us to opt, as I've said before, for two options. Both the Ministry for the Future and Mary Murphy, but also Bahadur's Children of Kali. The focus of the novel falls overwhelmingly on the ministry, on its legal constitutional solutions to the problem. But the terrible opening scenes of the Indian heatwave echo throughout the text as prior justification for the children of Kali's ecoterrorism. And you cannot move away. I mean, the novel leaves us with the thought that both these options can work. The third novel, Burgmann's The Australian novel, Burgmann's Children of Tomorrow, has its Freddie Backer willingly put at risk the lives of thousands of people, not least those of his lover and his nephew. But the eventual outcome is positive. It is a post-catastrophic Eden, not only for Anna and Evie, but also for their daughter Jasmine and their granddaughter Aloy. Now, both Tuomainen and Burgmann envisage that's the Finnish and the Australian, both envisage an essentially catastrophist future. Although Burgmann imagines that catastrophe as leading to ultimately positive results, precisely because it destroys the major institutions of the existing system. Only Robinson of the three retains some residual hope in the pre-catastrophic institutions, in particular the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations. Now, this actually seems to me, this might well render it the most rhetorically persuasive of the three novels, because it moves on two fronts. It moves both in terms of the legal constitutional strategy and the use of ecoterrorism. Which takes me back to I'm just going to end my remarks now. I want to return to my opening remarks about anti-Nazi resistance fictions. I had a wonderful picture here of the Nuremberg war crimes trials, which I was going to show on the PowerPoint if I was still in control of my PowerPoint. But what I was going to use that for was to suggest that those resistance terrorists in Europe, well, and actually also in East Asia, against the Japanese, they were rendered heroic and noble despite their obviously terrorist nature through their endorsement, both prospective and retrospective, by the Allied governments, by precisely their implied endorsement by the war crimes trials conducted against both the Japanese and the Germans. It was their accusers who were arraigned in those trials, not the terrorists themselves. This is a difficult trick to pull off, to turn for the terrorists to turn against the governments of which they're trying to terrorize and to hold them to account. It's a difficult trick to pull off, both in reality and in fiction. In reality, of course, it took 6 years of warfare to defeat Germany, for the British to defeat Germany, and 6 years for the Allies to defeat Japan. But in fact, after 6 years of enormously bloody warfare, in which I think 105 million people died, yes, the Nazi terrorists were finally arraigned, and the Japanese in those war crimes tribunals. But it's also a difficult trick to pull off in fiction. And I want to conclude by saying that nonetheless, Robinson manages to pull off the trick. And that's where I will end my paper. I hope it dovetails with the other papers on Robinson. And I do apologize for my loss of my PowerPoint. I have no idea where it went, but I hope you could hear me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Milner, for this wonderful talk. And we will always remain grateful to you for this enriching talk, and it will be archived on our Center for Research in Post-Humanities YouTube channel. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.